I know you all have questions, so I will be brief. I've never actually given one of the talks here, but our work has taken a very different turn that overlaps with this, and I thought you would be interested in it. While I may say I want to be very clear that an awardee that you awarded this, one of your young investigator prizes to a couple of years ago, Elizabeth Irons, is one of the people most responsible for this, along with Catherine, Nanette Dorea, and Alberto Montero, and a few others. So for some time, we wanted to understand how breast cancer spread throughout the body, how it became metastatic. A lump in the breast is unpleasant, but it doesn't kill you. Breast cancer kills you because it spreads. And so we felt that if we could understand the tricks that a cancer acquired to allow it to jump over the fence and get out of the breast and grow in the lung or brain or something, we'd know something. So we had to establish a model in which human breast cancer, starting off in the breast of an animal, would go everywhere. And we did that. And we were able to look at these breast cancer cells that had now left the breast and were living in the lung and liver. And we could say what we thought would be the straightforward questions. How were they different? What were their new tricks? However, we thought also, why don't we look not at the breast cancer in the liver or the breast cancer in the lung? Let's look at the lung and liver and see if they're different. And we were shocked to discover that when we had a breast cancer that was capable of spreading elsewhere in the body of this animal, in those tissues, there were new signals. And those signals turned out to represent new cells that had come to populate lungs and liver and bone. And we had no idea, where did they come from? And to keep this story brief, what we found out was that in addition to normal liver cells that live in your liver, when you had a breast cancer that could spread to the liver, there was now a group of cells, which are cells that Alberto Montero studies called myeloid-derived suppressor cells. And what they are a nasty group of cells that turn off your immune system. So somehow, throughout the body of these animals, a breast cancer in the breast was saying, why don't you, all you nasty cells, come to these sites and potentially make it possible for a breast cancer to grow there? That's what we worried about. We then proved that how this happened. We found out that the breast cancers secreted hormones. We call them cytokines, that they got into the circulation of these animals. These cytokines signaled these myeloid-derived suppressor cells to come out of the marrow and go and live in all these sites. And we proved this was the case by experiments that I don't really want to quite go into, but let me say we firmly showed that the ability of these cancer cells to recruit these immune suppressor cells was critical to the metastatic process. In other work, Alberto proved that these cells circulate in women, and that women who had more of them died far more frequently than women who did not. Then the hugest surprise, and this was absolutely startling. I hadn't been reading about depression. I hadn't been reading much about obesity, though perhaps I should. It turns out that these are inflammatory diseases, as you have heard, and it turns out that these diseases have in the circulation of women exactly the same cytokines that we had showed were being produced by the breast cancer cells to recruit these immunosuppressive cells. So now imagine hands on a tug of rope. One hand pulling of these cytokines that the breast cancers are making. Maybe not enough. But then after a few years, you get depressed. And maybe you get more of them. Or maybe you gain a little weight and you get more of them and you get enough to tip a balance. Breast cancer is an extraordinarily cruel disease. Everyone in this room knows that after 2 or 3 years or 5 years, you're not safe. So if it can come back in 10 or 15 years, it must mean that there were breast cancer cells around all that time. Were they sleeping? Or were they simply suppressed by an immune system that they may then have failed? So this has made my tremendous link with David, because he's studying all these depressed women. And what we're trying to do is to see whether or not, for example, a psychotherapeutic intervention changes these cytokines, which would provide an absolutely lovely mechanism for how psychotherapy might work, or why it is certain that losing weight is a protection against breast cancer recurrence. And perhaps that's a unifying hypothesis. I'm giving you a lot of speculation. I don't care. I can get away with it. But my point is, you can see how the focus in this is not simply on the evilness of a cancer cell, but how it can subvert normal cells that we need for our normal immune functioning to give a permissive place for a cancer to grow. So that's what we're working on. And it should be obvious that if part of the way a breast cancer is bad for you is because it secretes stuff that gets into your bloodstream that signals these other nasty cells, that ought to be a straightforward thing to go after therapeutically. And it is, and that's what we're trying to do right now. You could imagine different ways you could get something out of your system, just like you could dialyze it out. And so that's our thinking about how that might go. So anyway, that's what we work on with all of these people together. Thank you.